Hey guys, and here we go with MindMAP Mastery Module 1, Lesson 3. And this is where we're going to start the process of digging in a little bit more into, I guess you could say, the landscape of the brain. So we're not deep diving into brain physiology and neuroscience at this point. We're just going to take a little guided tour around the brain, what it's about, what it wants, what it needs, and a bit of an understanding about the responsibility of different zones of the brain, so that when we come to recycle back through the information again in lessons 4, 5, and 6, you've got a kind of a base working vocabulary and a base identification for the different zones of the brain that we're going to be working with. Okay, so let's just dive straight in. Now, in the last session, we spoke about the various mind map realities, and we got all the way up to mind map reality number 12. Now, I just want to introduce you to mind map reality number 13, which is that your role as a coach is to serve the brain what it wants and what it needs, and then ultimately get the hell out of the way. Okay, let's say that again. Your role as a coach is to serve the brain what it wants, what it needs, and then get the hell out of the way. So in order to be able to answer that question, kind of what does the brain want and what does the brain need? Obviously, we need to have an understanding of brain science. Okay, and that's really what this module is all about. So let's dive straight into it. First off, there's your brain, right? So we've got this amazing organ, which in reality turns out not to be one organ. It's kind of, you could think of it as being 3 separate organs contained within the same kind of base structure. We label the whole thing together as a brain, but really there are these 3 very definitely distinct zones, distinct areas of the brain. And depending upon which aspects of science you tend to study around the brain, it can even be divided up into more sections, right? So as you see from this picture, we've got, that purple area there is the brain stem. Just to the right of the purple area, that small fibrous looking bunch at the lower right hand side, we've got the cerebellum. Above the cerebellum to the right, we've got the occipital lobe. Above the occipital lobe, we've got the parietal lobe in that yellow section. To the front of that, we've got the frontal lobe, and then beneath that in green, we've got the temporal lobe. Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of different zones across the brain, fulfilling different roles, and even within each one of those structures, there are substructures that fulfill separate and sometimes distinctly different roles compared to the overall lobe. So, in many respects, it can, at first sight, be a little bit complicated to most people. But I'm going to take you through the let's say kind of the first pass, right? The low level introduction to what's going on as we work our way around each one of these zones. Before we do that, let's just have a little bit of a conversation about what the brain's role really is, right? Okay, we tend to end up with all of these different ideas about why we have brains and what kind of roles they serve. But really, ultimately, when you break it down, the brain's role is to recognize patterns. You could say that the brain is a pattern recognition and a pattern meaning and a pattern responding machine. That's all it is. So as you go about your day-to-day life, you have a pattern called oxygen, and there's both a pattern for what good air, so to speak, should taste like to your senses. Certainly that if you enter a smoky environment, you'll start to cough. Why is that? Well, it's because the pattern for what would normally be air has changed, and so your brain becomes threatened by the change to the pattern, and it carries out its emergency roles to make sure that you don't do anything that's going to be harmful to the organism, i.e. you. Okay, so you've got patterns for air, you've got patterns for water. Like if you go and pour yourself a glass of water from the kitchen tap right now, and you look at that water and it's all cloudy and it's got little bits in, immediately you're probably going to pour that water away and try and pour yourself another glass, right? Why? Because you've got a pattern recognition system that says when water is safe, it doesn't have a smell, it doesn't have bits in it, it's not cloudy, and it doesn't look murky and horrible. That is your pattern recognition. So you can see that we've got patterns for literally everything. Patterns for what things should look like, what things should taste like, smell like. Absolutely every single thing that you come into contact with across the course of your life is ultimately a pattern that's been embedded by the brain, and for a very, very simple reason, for the brain to ask the question, is this safe? Okay, so because we're able to recognize patterns, we are able to keep ourselves alive in circumstances and situations that would obviously, if we had to kind of reinvent the wheel every single time we went into a new environment and figure out for ourselves whether drinking that water was safe or whether breathing that air was safe, or whether, you name it, kind of whether whatever we find in our environment is safe, then of course our decision making is going to be slow. And if our decision making is going to be slow, we're going to both miss out on opportunities and also become encumbered by various risks. Okay, so the brain is ultimately a pattern recognition machine. So that should give you some of your first clues as to a lot of the work that we need to do with our clients. Okay, so we've not reached that point just yet, but understanding that very often then threat is simply the inability to create patterns or to make sense of patterns. And that when you help the client to see patterns in their life that maybe they are unaware of, you create greater safety. When you help your client to kind of devise and design new patterns that can get them to where they want to go faster and easier and cleaner and clearer, they're often going to respond very, very well as well, because it's all in the pattern. That is the brain's role. It's a pattern recognition machine. So why do we want patterns? We want patterns so that we can create predictions. Okay, we create those predictions based upon the pattern. I've got a pattern called, I'm sitting here in a room at the moment, and I've got a pattern based on safety that kind of says, well, there's not dust coming down from the ceiling and the building isn't shaking and it doesn't feel like an earthquake's about to hit my room. Therefore, I'm safe, right? I'm able to create a prediction. So we use patterns to create predictions, and ultimately, again, those predictions are mostly about keeping us safe, and secondarily, they're about helping us to go out into the world and take advantage of opportunities as they arise, but primarily it's about safety. So you've got a prediction about that water. You recognize the pattern of what is normal drinking water. If you see a glass of water that looks absolutely clear, it's just come out of the tap. It's clear. There's no weird, funny smell, and kind of you place it to your lips. There's no weird and funny taste. Then you've got a prediction based upon that pattern that kind of says drinking this water is safe, and you don't give it another thought. You don't use up your mental processing power. If you come across water that's cloudy and it's got bits in, or it smells funny or tastes funny when you touch it to your lips, immediately you start to run a different prediction pattern called, okay, is this going to be safe for me, or is this going to cause me harm? Okay, so brain's role: 1, to recognize patterns; 2, to create predictions based upon those patterns. And again, think about that from a coach's perspective. The more you can do with your clients to create predictions, the more likely they are to feel safe, and the more likely they are to use their brain's processing power for taking advantage of opportunities, rather than having to deal with kind of perceived risks all day long. Number 3 is to create responses based upon those predictions. Okay, so 1 is to recognize the patterns, 2 is to create predictions based upon those patterns, 3 is to create the responses based on those predictions. Because obviously, kind of you want to now figure out, you've got some information that's just come into your brain. Now your brain wants to figure out what to do about the information, and that information might be, okay, go ahead and drink. That information might be, yep, go ahead and breathe. That information might also be, okay, you are seeing the kind of dust coming out of the ceiling, and you're hearing the building kind of groan and quake and all the rest of it. Go and get yourself to safety. Okay, create the responses based upon the predictions. And again, when you really, really think about it, a lot of the struggle and strife that our clients go through is because they often don't have a pattern that they can draw upon. They don't have a prediction that they can use, and they certainly don't have responses based upon those predictions. So that instead of a response-based style of living, they end up in a reactive-based style of living. Okay, one where their brain just goes in and runs the patterns that the brain thinks are best to deal with this current situation. And sometimes the brain makes great choices. Okay, sometimes the brain makes great choices to get, to have you panic and start sweating and feeling really uneasy about being in a building that's quaking and groaning when there's dust coming from the ceiling. That uneasiness, that queasiness, and that creating the response of, oh my God, I have to get the hell out of here, is a perfect one. Other times with situations maybe at work or in your relationships, etc., it is often not choosing the best possible response, and in fact it's choosing a reaction instead. And obviously during the course of this program we'll be digging deeper into that. So number 4 is to create movements based upon those responses. Okay, so your brain has decided that the water is safe to drink. Now it has to access a different part of the brain in order to make sure that it knows the correct movements to carry out. Okay, and that might be from the cerebellum perspective, and don't worry, we'll talk about this, we'll go into it in a lot more depth, but it may be occurring from the cerebellum perspective to kind of say, okay, where am I now, and what's all the information that's coming into me? Do I know where my hand is, my elbow is, my shoulder, my neck? Sounds like a weird question, right? But your brain is asking yourself these questions all the time. Do I know where the bits of me are relative to the other bits of me? And do I know where the bits of me are relative to the other things on this planet, in this room? Do I know how far it is for me to reach my hand out and grab hold of that tap and turn it back off again, or to place that glass to my lips? Do I know where all these things are? So your brain is seeking to create these movements based upon the responses. The cerebellum will take part of that role, and the parietal lobe, that kind of yellowy section up the top there, that will take on part of the role as well, as it builds out the best possible motor pattern to bring about the best possible, most efficient, most effective movement possible, right? So we've got the brain's role to recognize patterns, to create predictions based upon those patterns, to create responses based on those predictions, to create movements based on those responses, so that ultimately it's doing all of this so that it can survive the environment. That's it. That's the brain's number one concern, is to survive its environment. And that means that it will always put survival ahead of anything else. And when we come into kind of a bit more of the deeper brain science in the next couple of lessons, you'll see how the brain will actually push away any ideas of thriving, as in goal achievement, as in kind of thinking ahead to where you want to be in 6 months' time, as into thinking about what you want the number on the scale to be and all that kind of stuff. It will throw all of that away in favor of pure survival. Ultimately, I guess the way you could imagine it is that the brain thinks to itself, well, that's great, kind of as long as I survive, I can go back and I can look at my goals, and I can look at my desires, and I can look at all the things that I want to be possible for me as I go about life. But if I'm dead, if I can't survive my environment, then all of that becomes a bit of a moot point. It all becomes irrelevant, right? So its first priority is to survive the environment. As we move deeper into this program, you're going to see that, unfortunately, a lot of very, you could say, everyday, like humdrum kind of things that really shouldn't feel like threat to us as human beings, have been elevated in certain parts of the brain to be just as dangerous as sitting here drinking poisoned water, or just as dangerous as the building about to collapse in on top of us, so that we can make that number on the scale just as important from a brain science perspective as the fact that we might be standing on the edge of a cliff and about to die, right? Sounds really weird when we say it at this level. You're sitting there kind of, watching this video, listening to this audio, and thinking, how can the brain possibly consider that not hitting a number on the scale is a life-threatening event? And when we get to that section of the program, you'll see it's very, very possible, because ultimately the brain is a meaning machine. Okay, you can give the brain the meanings that you want to give it, and elevate the importance of certain stimulus, certain ideas, certain concepts, so much so that the brain feels like it's under threat the entire time. But ultimately, let's get back on track with this. Ultimately, all of this pattern recognition, all the way through to creating the motor patterns, so that the brain can survive its environment easily. Second, so that the brain can take advantage of opportunities, right? So great, we survive the environment. Now I can go and take advantage of opportunities. And from a brain science perspective, that might be taking over new territory. It might be finding new food, getting a new mate. Like when we take the brain back to its old, its old drivers, it's as simple as that. And interestingly enough, as we start to look at human behavior, or as we start to look at what we call human behavior during this program, we're going to kind of create some clear distinctions that some behaviors are definitely not human. But at the moment, because we've not introduced the concept yet, as we look at human behavior, we'll see that really, at every level, like when we're going for that new car, when we're going for that new job, when we're going for the new house and all that kind of stuff, usually we are ultimately taking care of some of our old animalistic survival tendencies, kind of looking for the new territory, kind of looking for the new food, kind of looking for the new mate, and to spread our genes and all that kind of fun and funky stuff. Okay, so 1, survive the environment. 2, take advantage of opportunities. And 3, self-actualize. Okay. Later on, we'll be talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and a few other kind of cool concepts that are related to kind of what it is that our brain is conspiring to do for us, and what it is that the various areas of the brain is actually trying to help us to do. But for now, kind of self-actualization is all of that forward-thinking, cool stuff about living in that house on the hill, or living in on that house by the beach, or the kind of the 2.4 kids, or the amount of money that you want in the bank, or kind of getting that recording contract, or whatever it is. It's the stuff that has nothing to do with pure survival, but the stuff that has absolutely everything to do with definition of self, like who you want to be as the human being part of yourself, not who you want to be as the animalistic perspective, right? So this is pretty much it. The brain wants to survive its environment, take care of opportunities, and self-actualize. Okay, and in order to do that, the brain really requires just a handful of base materials, if you will, right? Base material number 1, it needs fuel, it needs glucose. And again, as we deep dive into the brain physiology, we'll talk about this a lot more. But first off, the brain doesn't need anywhere near as much glucose as we tend to think. I mean, it does use up a fair bit of the stuff. The brain is actually one of the highest glucose consumers, right? But that said, just when we get stressed, we need a bit more glucose into the brain. We don't need as much as like that 3 pints of Haagen-Dazs that most people end up consuming, but we do need that fuel. And there are things that can kind of get in the way of that fuel delivery, and there are certain types of thinking that tend to use up the glucose in the brain much faster. So, for example, moving into that prefrontal cortex, that big red area at the front there, generally tends to be a high fuel consumption based activity. The human brain is, in many respects, the least efficient part of the brain. Okay, so when at this point, the human brain is the prefrontal cortex, and that is the least efficient part of the brain. It uses up inordinate amounts of fuel, and very, very quickly, which is why whenever you do anything really thinky, that's a real term, by the way, whenever you do anything really thinky, you will tend to kind of suffer like what most people would call that brain fatigue or that brain fog. Why? Because you've used up your fuel. And again, don't worry about it too much for now. It's just important that you understand that this is so, and there are different parts of your brain that use more fuel. There are different parts of the brain that use less fuel. There are signs and symptoms, if you will, of when you are kind of moving toward depleting your brain, and when certain activities should really be stopped. When you should say, okay, I've done enough work on this for now, as opposed to pushing yourself into that brain fatigue, which is actually likely to steal so many of your positive feelings out of what you've accomplished, and so likely to move you away from levels of certainty and prediction and response and pattern recognition and all that good stuff we've just been talking about, and instead move you back to uncertainty and threat and fear and everything else, okay, just by using up your fuel stores. So we'll talk about that obviously in some later lessons, and particularly when it comes down to using the prefrontal cortex as a driver for kind of habituation and new patterns. But for right now, it's just important for you to know that is a factor, that fuel in the form of glucose is a vital requirement for the brain in order for the brain to do what it most needs to do. Just like when the computer you're listening to this on at the moment is, if it's hopefully it's either plugged into a main source or you've got a cool battery, and that battery is providing all the energy it needs, right? When that battery runs out, it doesn't matter how intelligent your machine is, you can have a top-of-the-range computer, but once the battery is run out, you can't access all of the cool stuff that your computer can do, right? So it's pretty much the same in the human brain. Next, it needs oxygen. I mean, obviously, kind of as a living organism, we need oxygen. Okay, the brain uses up a fair bit of oxygen. Okay, for quite a small organ, the brain kind of consumes, and it depends on who you read, but anywhere between kind of 20 to 25% of the body's overall oxygen at rest is being used up by the brain. You think about it. I mean, that's a lot. You think about all that muscle and bone and ligament and tendon and blood and lymph and everything else that's all taking up oxygen, and your brain is using pretty much between a quarter and a fifth of all of the oxygen coming into your body. That tells you something about the importance of the brain, and it tells you something about the role that oxygenation in itself plays in the human body. And it's outside the scope of this particular lesson at the moment, but later on we're going to talk about how we can use oxygen as a primary driver of centering the nervous system, of helping us get out of our sympathetic branch of the nervous system and get more toward our parasympathetic branch, and the very, very important role that plays in pulling you out of threat, pulling you out of the animal brains and moving you much, much, much more toward the human brain in that prefrontal cortex. But for now, understand that both oxygen is important, and that anything that interferes with the brain's ability to take up oxygen, and we'll be discussing that at great length a little bit later on, anything that interferes with the brain's ability to take up oxygen is increasing the brain's threat, which is the same as downgrading the functioning of the brain. And number 3 is stimuli. Okay, stimuli. And stimuli ultimately comes in the form of sensory information. So the things that you see, the things you hear, the things you smell, the things you taste, the things you touch, and your balance and your and heat and kind of internal information, what we know as interoception. Okay, so sensory information can be divided into 2 main branches. You've got exteroception, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, right? And then you've got interoception, which is things like balance and heat and pain and kind of all the, what a lot of us would call our gut feelings, the information that's coming to us from the universe inside of our body rather than the universe outside of it. And the brain needs this information because quite literally we make sense of our worlds. Okay, let that soak in. Quite literally we make sense of our worlds. As we go about our day-to-day living, we are sensing our world with our sensory system. And it's that sensory system that is picking up patterns, like is the music too loud, is the air too smoky, is the water too cloudy, all this kind of information. And remember, if we go back to where this whole thing started, the brain is a pattern recognition machine. That means that anything that affects the sensory system is affecting the brain. Okay, and that's from the visual layout of your home to what you see when you look in the mirror, to the expressions on other people's faces, to kind of, literally the artwork hanging on the walls in your house, to the music that you're playing in your car. All of it has the ability to move the brain very effectively into different states of being, different zones of the brain that will actually take over the main driving of the vehicle of your human body, so to speak. Okay, so for this reason, we have to be really careful and really attentive to what is going on from a sensory perspective. That means that we've got to look at like quite literally, we've got to look at our environments, but we've got to hear our environments in different ways, and we've got to smell our environments in different ways. As we move into that part of the program, we'll be talking about creating a multi-sensory experience that pulls the brain out of threat much, much faster and moves it more toward that self-actualization. Okay, and this is done very, very easily, but it needs to be done consciously. What's ever so slightly outside the scope of this program, but we will talk about it a little bit, is more from the body map perspective of the actual sensory machinery. Like if your eyes are, let's say you have an awesome home and you've laid it out how you want it, but your eyes aren't actually performing as well as they could do, then that's going to change the way sensory information comes in. If your ears aren't performing as well as they could do because you blast very, very loud music into your ears all day long, that's going to change the way the sensory information hits the brain. Okay, so we'll be talking about that too, about how to use sensory information as a tool for the body, as opposed to how to use sensory information as a weapon against it. Okay. So structure and function. Let's meet your brain. Okay, so I just spoke to you about it a second ago on the kind of the very colourful picture. Let's kind of work our way around it very slowly right now, or a little bit more slowly, just so that we can have a brief chat about it, so that when we move into the next exercise, as we move into the next lesson, you've got some common language that you're able to share with me. Okay, so let's start down here at the very bottom. This is the brain stem. Okay, this is the oldest part of the human, or what people generally tend to call the human brain, but in reality, the brainstem is the oldest part that is really our reptilian brain, like kind of from when we first crawled out of the seas as reptiles. This was the part of the brain that was running the show. Okay, and as you'll find when we move into the specific lobe and specific area lectures. The brainstem is concerned primarily with physiological survival. Okay, so finding enough food, staying warm enough, finding mates to kind of spread your genetics with, and all that kind of stuff, and fighting over territory. And ultimately, why do we fight over territory? So that we can have control of the food and we can have control of the mating, right? So it's a very primitive part of the brain. It doesn't mean it lacks. I guess you could say it lacks true intelligence in that it's not trying to figure out math and it's not about to try and write a book, but in terms of keeping you alive, the brainstem is king, right? The brainstem will do absolutely anything and everything in its power to keep you alive. And to be honest, that's the reason why a lot of clients are actually living fairly miserable lives, is because they are brainstem dominant. They are running patterns and procedures that are being absolutely governed by the brainstem to keep them alive. But that doesn't mean that there's any form of enjoyment going on in their lives, right? This is just pure survival. Okay, but that's the brainstem. Next, this section here is called the cerebellum, and the cerebellum quite literally translates as the little brain. Okay, from Latin, and the cerebellum is kind of again one of the older organs of the brain, which takes together all of the spatial and bodily information, like where am I in space, where is my hand relative to my foot, where is my head relative to my shoulders, and all that kind of stuff. So the first layer of what you could call proprioceptive and kinesthetic mapping, like all of that information about where you are relative to self and where you are relative to your environment, is all being contained in the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is creating these awesome little 3-dimensional maps, or even 4-dimensional, because it brings in the element of time as well. It's building these maps to let you know where your body is, so that at any moment in time, if let's say a predator appears out of your peripheral vision, the cerebellum can assist your brain along with the brainstem in making the decision very, very, very quickly to get the hell out of there, or to fight, flight, freeze, whatever it might happen to be. Okay, so there you go. There's your cerebellum, and again, it's mostly about mapping your physical self. This section here is known as the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe is right there at the rear of the skull, and it's the primary visual processing center. Okay, there are a couple of other visual processing centers as well. The brain doesn't actually just rely upon one part of the brain to carry out all of the work for any one task. Okay, so whilst the occipital lobe is the primary processing center, there are a couple of other areas in the brain too. Likewise, whilst the brainstem is kind of responsible for certain things, there are other areas of the brain that share parts of those responsibility. But in its simplest way of learning about the brain, it's easier for us to understand it from a kind of a lobe perspective first, before we get into the individual kind of sub areas of the brain, so to speak. So this area here is known as the parietal lobe. Okay, the parietal lobe is responsible. It does a lot of the work that the cerebellum does, but at a higher level, you could say, right? Whereas the cerebellum is much more immediate and reactive, you could say that the parietal lobe is a little bit more kind of thoughtful, if you will. The parietal lobe is now taking the computation that's coming in from the brainstem, coming in from the cerebellum, the occipital lobe, what it's seeing, and all this kind of stuff. It takes this information and it's building better sensory maps of where you are, so kind of adding more detail and more color and more clarity to the picture, so to speak. And on top of that, it's also creating the best possible and most efficient and effective movement pattern to carry out the task. So while the cerebellum will get you there, the parietal lobe will create a better, more efficient and more effective way of getting you there. Okay? And now right up here at the front of the brain, what we call the frontal lobe, weirdly enough. Okay? The frontal lobe is, you could say, is the seat of humanity. Okay, the frontal lobe is the seat of humanity. It houses most of what we term the human qualities. So things like logic, for example, in the left prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobe. And again, we'll be going in deeper later, so don't worry too much. But the frontal lobe is mostly about logic and creativity. It's got a few other roles there as well, and in terms of things of what we generally tend to refer to as things like willpower as well. Willpower kind of lives in a different part of the frontal lobe, and all of these things come together ultimately in order to help us take up opportunities and build futures, and as well as give meaning to the things that are in our environment, right? So, if you see a building on fire for the first time, it may not be completely relevant to you at all. Like for the very, very first time in your life, when you were a tiny, tiny little baby and you saw a fire somewhere, you had no meaning for it. And yet kind of later on, because of patterns, you saw people come running out of buildings and people crying and being upset because they've lost all of their possessions in the fire. Your frontal lobe is giving that experience meaning. And later on, if you ever happen to go past a burning building again, you'll get this sense of urgency and alarm and upset and concern and everything else because of the meaning that was passed into that experience via the frontal lobe. Okay, and again, don't worry if that's not 100% clear just at the moment. From our perspective, right now at this stage of the program, the frontal lobe is about logic, it's about creativity, and it's about giving things meaning. Okay, that's the primary roles that I want you to think about just at this point of the program. And then finally, for this workshop, we've got the temporal lobe. Okay, and the temporal lobe is ultimately the seat of what most of us would call emotion. And when we really look at it, the temporal lobe is much more of what kind of, as we move into the next parts of the course, we would call the mammalian senses of the brain. So this is all about connection. This is all about emotion. And there's a very specific way that the temporal lobe uses emotion to evoke certain movement patterns, both towards something or away from something. Okay, so you will get, the temporal lobe kind of highlights an experience because the frontal lobe gave the temporal lobe some information. It said this is important. The temporal lobe stores that information, and you'll either get happy or sad or fearful or whatever it happens to be. The temporal lobe will then have this conversation, so to speak, which will cause you to take certain actions either toward the opportunity or away from the threat. And again, this is just a skim over the top of the surface. So at this point in the program, I just want you to know what these lobes are, what they do, what their primary roles are, so that as we strip away and we go down a layer and we kind of look at what else is involved beneath this surface, it all starts to make sense for you. Okay, so we're going to end this lesson here at this point. And what I'd like you to do as a result of this lesson is go back over it again. Go back over, right from the start, like ideally listen to the audio several times, ideally watch the video several times, because this is, whilst we haven't gone deep yet, this is the base level fundamentals of being able to hold conversations with clients about the brain, and in order for you to kind of visualize what's going on in a client's brain and in a client's mind when you're working with them. Okay, so this hasn't gone super deep, but it does lay the storyline for everything else. In our next lessons, we'll be taking the information deeper, and we'll be taking what we call a triune brain theory look at the brain. Okay, so we'll go a little bit deeper, and we'll start to talk a little bit more about what each specific brain center wants from its experience of life. Okay, but for now, this is the end of lesson 3. Below this, there'll be the audio as usual. There'll be a little worksheet for you, just asking you a few questions. And again, even if you feel you can answer them verbally, take the time to print out the worksheet and work your way through answering the questions that are down there. It will make your experience of mind mapping and mind map coaching that much simpler, because ultimately, the biggest part of making the mind map experience powerful for your clients is your certainty around the brain information that you're going to share with them. Okay, so get as certain as you possibly can, and I will see you in the next lesson. Take care.